Testing, testing, 1, 2, 2, 2.
Okay, good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to this event. My name is Greg Barker. I'm the Executive Chairman of the N+ Group. We're the world's largest producer of low-carbon aluminium and private sector hydropower. But more importantly, I am co-chair of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, the CPLC. My public sector co-chair, Minister Jobé, is here beside me, and I'm moderating this. We're here today to talk about the interplay between carbon pricing, between net zero and a just and fair transition. Everyone will know, so long as people have been talking about climate change, they pretty much, certainly the economists, have been talking about carbon pricing. Yet it still languishes as an economic tool, despite the fact that it is by far the most effective driver of a low carbon economy. Today's panel will be addressing this issue, and we certainly know that if you bring smart politics and if you bring the technological solutions that are now available, that you can avoid the unintended consequences that perhaps have been associated with it in the past. But I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator, Mary Pangestu, to moderate this panel discussion. But before I do, it is with great pleasure that I invite a real champion of carbon pricing, and it's no understatement, our co-host here, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Justin Trudeau. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you all for being here today. C'est extrêmement important qu'on ait cette conversation, qu'on encourage les gens aussi fortement que possible de regarder la tarification du carbone comme un outil puissant pour transformer notre économie mondiale et atteindre le net zéro d'ici 2050. We all know, we've known for a long time that carbon pricing is one of the most powerful ways of reducing emissions and supporting and encouraging private sector and individual citizens to make smarter choices around reducing emissions at the same time as we create innovations to move forward. But it's hard. It's always been hard to do this in the way that we know citizens want more action on climate, but are always worried that they're going to be the ones paying for the brunt of it. And what a strong carbon price does when it's properly designed is actually drive those price signals to the private sector, transform the economy, and support citizens in encouraging them to make better choices. In Canada, we have a price on pollution that's going to rise to $170 a ton by 2030, which makes it among the strongest in the world, and at the same time one of the most stringent in the world, covering about 75% of our emissions. Those are two metrics that we need to start looking at around the world, but the reality is there are many different ways of putting a price on pollution in different sectors. In Canada, we know from one province to the other, there have been different approaches. And what matters is to establish a principle of stringency and equity that makes sure that everyone is pricing at the same level. And that's why one of the things I think we all know needs to come out of COP is a clearer call to create a global standard around putting a price on pollution. Not only will that encourage innovation, give that clear price signal to the private sector that making the right capital investments to transform to lower emissions makes sense, but it also ensures that those who are leading on pricing pollution don't get unfairly penalized. We've had to bring in particular mechanisms to make sure that we're not unfairly penalizing particularly trade-exposed industries, but we'd love to not have to do that, and the more countries come on board with carbon pricing, the more we make sure that everyone around the world gets to do their part and push things in the right direction. The other piece of it, if we recognize right now that only about 20% of global emissions are covered by a price on pollution, we should be ambitious and say, as of right here today, that we want to triple that. 60% of global emissions should be covered by a price on pollution in 2030. Nous appelons à la planète entière, au gouvernement de la planète, de tripler la couverture d'un prix sur la pollution et de s'assurer que 60% des émissions à travers le monde soient captées par un système de tarification du carbone. C'est un idéal, un objectif ambitieux, mais c'est un objectif qu'on peut atteindre. We know it. Leaders know it, scientists know it, and the private sector knows it, that putting a price on pollution is the most efficient and powerful way to keep 1.5 alive. That's the call collectively we're making today, and I'm so pleased that so many people have pledged themselves to be part of it. I would be remiss not to give a shout out to our Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, who's here today. We have a number of partners from Environment Ministers from subnational governments. One of our premiers, Andrew Furey, is here. But I also want to recognize the hard work of our previous Environment Ministers, including Catherine McKenna and Jonathan Wilkinson, who's now our Minister of Natural Resources, who will deeply be involved in energy. Canada is committed to leading on this, and we're so glad there are so many others stepping up to be part of it. Merci beaucoup.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Prime Minister Trudeau and Lord Barker for hosting this or coordinating this really distinguished roundtable. We are meeting at the 6th anniversary of the CPLC, and as we face the climate crisis and we know that the NDCs are not quite there yet, we need to increase ambition and action, and carbon pricing will be an important tool within that toolbox. And we have, as the World Bank, we are hosting the CPLC Secretariat, and we have been working with other partners and other programs in a partnership for market implementation of carbon pricing. And we have advanced the use of carbon pricing across regions and sectors. And in the last 6 years, CPLC has done a lot to bring government, private sector partners to share, network, and learn about the role of carbon pricing. And I think the evidence, both Prime Minister and Lord Baker have mentioned it, that carbon pricing can play a role. Designed right, it can play a role in the policy mix to increase climate ambition. And in the G20 leaders communique, this was emphasized just yesterday or 2 days ago. And second, one of the studies we did in 2017 or 2018 showed that it doesn't have to come at the cost of reducing competitiveness. In fact, it can increase your competitiveness design in the right way. So the role of private sector and trade is very important in there. And it can also achieve sustainable development at the same time. So we have a lot of this evidence, and now it's up to us to really see how we can implement it, as the Prime Minister said, in more countries, in more sectors, and do it in a consistent and comprehensive way. So really, it's an honor for me to moderate this distinguished roundtable to discuss these issues around carbon pricing. I will now introduce the speakers and then ask them each questions. I'm happy to say this is a perfectly gender-balanced panel, moderator included. Yeah. We have we have 7 very distinguished panelists today. We have Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, Stefan Löfven, Prime Minister of Sweden, Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the WTO, Mahendra Singh, CEO of Dalmia Cement, Mark Carney, UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. I will start with Ursula. If I can ask you about the experience of the European Union. The European Union is very diverse, and yet you have succeeded in implementing a carbon pricing system that works across many different economies. What can the global community learn from this example of collaboration and price consistency?
Thank you so much. And Justin, thank you very much for inviting me here, hosting this event. It is so important. Indeed, our experience in the European Union is that carbon pricing works. We have introduced an emission trading system in 2005. And for you to know, the European Union, that's 450 million people and 27 member states, very different, one from each other. Stefan Löfven knows it. He's sitting with me in the council. But we introduced an emission trading system. Of course, at the beginning, you make your learning experiences, you make some mistakes, but now it's a mature one. And what it has proven is that it helped us decouple growth from greenhouse gas emissions. So you can prosper while cutting emissions. If I give you a broad number, since 1990, we have reduced the greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, while growing by 60%. So this is the first very important message. What did we do? We put an emission trading system on industry appliances, installation, and power plants, so energy. Industry and energy is covered since 2005 by a carbon price through the emission trading system. Since then, we were able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in this sector, those sectors, by 45%. And that shows the power of the emission trading system. We were even able to lower our overall targets that we have in the whole economy. We were able to overshoot our target. We had for 2020 the target of 20%. We matched, or we reached 31%, and it was mostly due to the emission trading system. Now, right now, we have introduced our detailed roadmap, how we're going to reach our goals in 2030. And for that, we did, first of all, strengthen the emission trading system on the existing industry and energy mix. Second, we extended to maritime. That's very interesting. So whoever is shipping through the European Union or in a certain radius around the European Union, whatever ship it is, they have to pay a price on carbon. So there's a huge incentive to move to other alternative fuels. And we will build a new emission trading system on road transport and heating and cooling in buildings. This is not trivial. This is very difficult to do. But with all the experiences we had now from industry and energy production, we are confident that we're going to be able to do that. And here, I want to just mention a few principles that make us so confident. First of all, this instrument is market-driven. Secondly, and this is the most important, it nudges the business sector to find alternatives through innovation. If they want to avoid the carbon price, well, they have to go into clean technologies. And of course, through this innovation, we're benefiting a lot. It is very cost efficient. And it is important that you design it socially fair. And here, for me, are 2 points that are very important. We take the huge amount of revenues, on one hand, to invest it in innovation and developing clean technologies. This is absolutely important. And on the other hand, to socially balance the effects on vulnerable households and on small businesses that cannot avoid the pressure of the carbon price. Think about road transport or heating and cooling of building. Vulnerable households need to have a compensation. My last point, if we would live in a perfect world, I would love to have a global price on carbon for everybody and everything globally. So that would be perfect. We will, to avoid carbon leakage, now introduce slowly but surely a carbon border adjustment mechanism that says, if you come with a dirty product to our market, you have to pay a price as if you were in the emission trading system in the European Union. But we prefer you keep the money in your economy by putting a price on carbon in your economy. And this is what we want to discuss with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ursula. Those were really, really very good points. And the principles, I think everybody will remember those principles. Over to you, Kristalina. You have often spoke about the importance of climate risk as macro and financial risk, and that carbon pricing is a key part of any comprehensive climate mitigation strategy, and IMF has also called for a global minimum carbon price. Why is this alignment on pricing so important, and how could this be coordinated?
Fantastic to join you all. For the benefit of full disclosure, I'm very attached to putting a price on carbon for many, many decades. It was in 1999 when we created the first prototype carbon fund to show that it is possible to assign a price on carbon. Why am I so attached to it? To quote a very famous Scotsman, Adam Smith, the father of economics, it is not for the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we get our dinner, but because of their self-interest. Putting a price on carbon generates that self-interest. So the good news, we are climbing up in terms of jurisdictions adopting a carbon price. The most recent arrival, Uruguay, introduced $120 per ton of carbon tax. Not so good news. The average global price of carbon today is $3. If we are to make a dent on emissions in a meaningful way to retain our hope for 1.5 degree, close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, by 2030 we have to be at $75 a ton or more. How can we get from here to there? At the IMF, we propose to introduce an international carbon price floor as a way to bring first large emitters so they have compatible pricing of carbon. What we suggest is that we make it equitable. In other words, it is a differentiated price depending on level of development. For poor countries, it is lower. For middle-income countries, somewhat higher. For rich economies, of course, they need to strive to pay more. We also want this international carbon price floor to be pragmatic. We believe that carbon tax is the best way to go. It is most efficient, but carbon trade also delivers incentives for innovation, and as we heard from the President of the European Commission, it works. We also would like to build a tent that is even bigger than tax and trade and allow for regulatory equivalency to a carbon price for those jurisdictions where it is politically not possible today to move forward. So the work we need to do is to create these equivalencies, equivalency of level of development and equivalency of what is the instrument you use. I am optimistic. Why? Because if we don't go there, as Ursula said, there will have to be border adjustment tax. For Ngozi, the Director General of WTO, that would be a huge headache, but it would be also much less efficient than if we all move to adopt a carbon price regime with equivalencies that make it work. Thank you.
Brilliant, Kristalina. Very good explanation of I mean, CBAM is on everybody's mind in developing countries right now, but your argument for coordination, very, very, very well put. Prime Minister Trudeau, let me turn to you. Canada's federal carbon pricing system has opted for a very unique approach of revenue return, one that sees a vast majority of proceeds returned to the citizens through the tax system. I guess this speaks to what Ursula was saying as designing in a social, fair way. What were the lessons learned and why did Canada choose that system?
Well, first of all, as sometimes at these international meetings, I have to remind people that Canada isn't some magical place where it's easy to do difficult, progressive things. It's hard to do them in Canada, as it is all around the world when we want to make the big right changes we need to do. Canada is a major oil and gas producing country. Our requirements on both heating and cooling, because of temperature extremes, our vast lands, means that this wasn't an easy and obvious thing for us to do. It was something that we knew was the right thing to do. But just as people around the world, Canadians want us to do more to fight climate change, they're also worried about being able to afford their groceries, about being able to afford their rent and heat their homes, and be able to succeed and thrive and have their families succeed and thrive. But we know that putting a price on pollution and incentivizing people to make better choices while making sure that life remains affordable for people is at the center of it. And there are many different prices on pollution in different jurisdictions that incentivize. I mean, we were inspired by British Columbia's model of carbon price that did an excellent job early on in Canada, but it didn't return money directly to people. It invested in the kinds of green transformations when needed. It was very effective because of that. We were worried about the ability to do that across the country. So we made a decision to return more than the average cost of the carbon price for your average family to them every year so they could spend the money on things they want, which means that with that climate action incentive that we return to people, if they choose to invest or spend money on more fuel-efficient vehicles or climate-friendly purchases, they will save more of that money, and we make sure to bring them along in this direction. And it has been extremely effective in giving that price signal to citizens and to businesses, and that's where we're going to continue to do that work as we increase in jurisdictions that have adopted or have been forced to take on the national pricing model. That money is incentivizing people in a progressive way because, of course, lower income families spend less on large houses and on multiple cars, so they actually get to keep more of their those carbon action, or that carbon incentive counts more for them rather than people who have to heat swimming pools and large homes and all those sorts of things. So the challenge we have is making something that is fair, that brings Canadians along. And yes, it was challenged by our political opponents. We had to fight all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, but we had the right ruling that allows us to keep it in place. We won that battle. And we also, more importantly for politicians worried about bringing in a price on pollution, saw 2 elections give a very clear consensus by the vast majority of Canadians that carbon pricing and putting a price on pollution is the right path forward. We won both of those elections, and that signal as well is something that people around the world should know. Putting a price on pollution is the most efficient way to lower emissions. It's the best way to send clear, predictable signals to private sector for the investments they need to make, and when it's done right, can not only reassure citizens that we're doing what we need to on fighting climate change, it can actually ensure that life remains affordable for them. Nous devons de montrer le leadership qui amène les gens avec nous. C'est exactement ce que nous faisons et ce que nous allons travailler avec le reste du monde pour faire ailleurs. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Yes, that deserves a round of applause for your leadership and political will to see this through. I hope many more leaders will follow in your path. Stefan Löfven, you have the world's first carbon tax, and I think you have won the prize for having the highest price of carbon. What kind of changes have you seen in the economy as a result of carbon pricing?
First, thank you so much, Justin, for gathering us here, and thank you for the theme. It's very important. First, let me say, I think it's time now that we change the narrative. We have for a long time described the green transition as something very blurry. It's something we cannot achieve. It will be worse economy and everything. It's the contrary. We need to talk about we're moving towards a better society, not only when it comes to emissions, but also when it comes to the economy, because something that is sustainable is stronger and better. Now, moving to our carbon tax, we introduced that 1991, and to be honest, I think maybe Finland were a bit ahead of us. I'm not really sure, but we have the highest price, so we compensate for that. But anyhow, that was 1991. Since then, the emissions, we reduced emissions by some 30%, and some say even more. But at the same time, our growth, our average growth over this 30 years period is plus 2%. 2% on average every year. So it shows that it doesn't hurt the economy, but it requires that you do it in a perhaps slow way. You have to introduce it and you increase so people get adjusted to it, and you also incentivize, as you also said, Justin, you need to give people alternatives so that they can see this is both bad and it's going to be expensive, but this alternative is better. And for us, the households, for example, in Sweden, we expanded the district heating a lot over the years. So we gave them an alternative. And now also on the transport sector, we'll continue to both, it'll be more and more expensive with gas, but it will be also the oil companies are obliged to increase biofuel systematically, more and more biofuel to gas. So you have incentives, tough legislation, but first and foremost, the picture of we are entering into a better society than we are leaving. I think that's the crucial message that we need to deliver.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Very well said. I think we need to change the narrative. It's not a trade-off between climate and growth or jobs. And for developing countries, similarly, it's not a trade-off between climate and development, and you can achieve both green, resilient, and inclusive recovery, growth, and development. Over to you, Ngozi. I'd like to ask you a question about what Kristalina was saying. Are these increasing talk of border measures to address emission from traded goods giving you a headache? And how do you see the international trade rules and agreements supporting global decarbonization? I mean, CBAM has been, as we know, being discussed quite a lot in developing countries, but at the same time, it's also making them think about carbon pricing. Over to you.
Thank you. D'abord, merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre, pour avoir invité l'OMC à participer à cette table ronde. Merci. Let me, I think Kristalina laid out the terrain a little bit for me to follow. It's quite exciting. I think people know I've been part of the coalition for carbon pricing for a while. So this is something I believe in, that we've got to give a signal, a market signal, so that this can also be governed like other goods and provide the disincentives for people to continue polluting. But the problem now at the WTO, you have to understand that we have 164 members, least developed countries, developing countries, and developed countries. A very diverse membership with different ideas about issues. And the problem that we face now is, much as I like the introduction of these regimes in different countries, we have a great deal of fragmentation. We have about 69 carbon pricing regimes now, if you add the CBAM. And what we, of course, as the WTO, we are hearing increasingly from business is that they're finding this very difficult to navigate. And when they find it difficult to navigate, then sometimes it results also in higher prices for consumers and others. So we have that issue of the fragmentation. We also have members who are afraid that this measure is somehow disguised protectionism, which is going to prevent them from being able to sell their products abroad. I'm not saying whether they are right or wrong. I'm just voicing what the fears are. And I think that we need to involve them in the conversation very quickly. Because what we have is different pricing regimes, a lot of them in developed countries, no real conversation with developing countries so they know that their issues are being considered. Now, I am somebody who has advocated a global carbon price. So I think we do have to have a carbon price. And I like very much the way that Kristalina and the IMF are approaching this issue, because it takes account of the floor, takes account of different stages of development. I feel that a global carbon price will be more transparent. It will be fairer. It will be easier to see and administer for countries to manage. So this is one of the reasons I'd like to see us move towards a global carbon price. Politically, it may also be easier for some governments to manage if they can say, look, this is being applied globally. Second, we have to convince finance ministers in developing countries. We've also not talked to them enough that this is another means of raising revenue. And what I hear from Ursula in the EU, from Prime Minister Trudeau, about returning money to citizens or finding some other way to invest the revenues that is beneficial, I think could be a good thing. But really, this issue of less than $1 per ton of CO2 emissions in Ukraine to $130 per ton in Sweden, and then now perhaps $170 per ton in Canada is a little challenging for developing countries and their businesses to navigate. So that's what, let's move towards a global carbon price. Let's, in fact, I've advocated that the IMF, the OECD, the WTO, and the World Bank should, that leaders should task these four institutions to work together and come up with an approach or approaches that will deliver what we're seeking for, which is this carbon price. Now, let me just add that the WTO provides a forum where we can initiate this dialogue with developing countries. And we'll be happy to provide that so that we can have this transparency and fairness and alleviate the fears that may not sometimes be founded that others have. I'll end by saying, look, at the WTO, our rules allow that member states can put in environmental policies. We don't have anything against it. And pricing, you know, if there are two principles that have to be respected. One is MFN, the most favored nation principle. So you should not discriminate against products from different, originating from different places. Two, national treatment. You shouldn't treat your products better than those coming in. If your pricing principles, if your approach respects these principles, then I say, you know, en principe, as they say in French, it shouldn't be difficult. But let me end by just saying developing countries need time. They need to be brought into the dialogue. Their issues need to be respected and taken into account as we develop these systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi. Couldn't agree with you more. So developing countries need time. We have to take into account their considerations, and they need a lot of capacity building. I would just like to add that. And our four institutions will definitely work towards that goal. Over to you, Mahendra, CEO of Dalmia Cement. You have been, I guess, got the title of the carbon pricing champion because Dalmia Cement has been recognized for its sustainability efforts. How do you see carbon pricing from your vantage, and what role can it play in the industrial decarbonization?
Thank you. Happy morning and happy afternoon, global sisters and brothers, Her and His Excellencies. Namaste. It's a great opportunity for me as a private business player and also a carbon pricing champion to be in the company of all these great leaders who have rightly highlighted what can be done for industry. In fact, decarbonization of industry is must for green and clean planet. Now the point is, how soon, how fast, and with whose support? I think the way World Bank Group took the initiative 6 years back to create a carbon pricing coalition has motivated many organizations in private sector. Of course, many European countries and other countries were taking actions, like already it has been said that maybe 1991 and many other years it has been done on carbon pricing. But at the same time, the moment which started has really helped many ways the industries to think about it. And that too, because in developing countries, there is no compulsion. Of course, in Europe, there are policies. But in developing countries, there are no such compulsion. Now, the forward-looking companies who are also part of CPLC, they started thinking about if carbon pricing does come, what to do, how to prepare ourselves. And then many companies started putting up internal pricing of carbon, just to understand if it happens, how it would impact my company, how it would impact my sector. And I would say, if you look at few such examples, you would find those companies could bring down their carbon footprints. Those companies also, surprisingly for many, they could become more profitable, more economical. And I think that's also the case of Dalmia Cement. There, we applied this philosophy of how we can put up internal carbon pricing, and at the same time, how also we can work for larger purpose. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share that in last 10 years, we could reduce our carbon footprints by 22%. We could grow by 3 times, and we could increase our profitability by 2 times. And that's, perfectly positioned ourselves and our business philosophy that clean and green is profitable and sustainable. So any initiative now by the government of any country which has economical impact would surely lead industries to think about how I should do it, what I should do it. Only point is, and more particularly for developing countries who are now coming forward for having net zero carbon roadmap, that is it possible to create a roadmap for carbon pricing also? In what way I should prepare myself? We all should be fully aware also, the awareness, the understanding of carbon pricing or the CO2 impact, what it has in developed world, what it has in developing world. And accordingly, I think we should take a stand. But I fully agree with the Prime Minister of Canada that yes, we should target that it should be around 60% by 2030. So until unless there is a target, nothing would happen. But I'm sure most of the industries now who are forward-looking, who are working with the government, they are thinking that yes, carbon pricing would come and we should prepare ourselves. Now, whether this carbon pricing can be supported by international carbon market, whether it can be also supported by green finance, there are a lot of ideas with the companies, but then particularly developing and least developing countries, but how to finance new technologies. So if that is there, then definitely international carbon market or green finance would play a very important role. And I'm happy that in India also, many companies have come forward to work on carbon pricing scenarios and working for bringing down carbon footprints. And lastly, I would say, my company, because of these efforts, have become one of the least carbon footprint cement company globally, and also could commit to become carbon negative by 2040. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahendra, for, I think, showing the way. I understand you introduced internal carbon pricing in your company's books to shift the expectations and nudge the behavior change that you talked about. And I really appreciate your, what was it, better, a clean, green, profitable, green, and sustainable business. Better business, better world. That's what I would say. So over to you, Mark. You have been a champion of this for a long time, and you were part of the original CPLC, I believe. And your question is, carbon pricing is not just about taxes and regulations, it is also about sending an investment signal. What does a price on carbon signal to investors and corporate executives? How can governments send a stronger signal through carbon pricing to support a transition to net zero at the pace required?
Tout d'abord, merci Marie et merci Monsieur le Premier ministre, cher Justin, pour cet événement et surtout pour ton leadership. I'm going to make 4 points from this perspective of investors, and I'm surrounded by real investors in the real economy, so I'll be careful. The first thing is that the carbon price today is interesting, but the carbon price towards the end of this decade is what's relevant. Because whether you're in the metals and mining sector, whether you're in the cement sector, whether you're in the auto sector, even in the tech sector, the types of investments that really will decarbonize take time to put in place and to yield the results. So what investors, what companies are looking at is that forward carbon price. And I'll come back to that point. The second thing is it's relevant what the people who finance investment are thinking. So I'll simplify it to the banks. And one of the big shifts in the last year is that we've moved to 2/3 of global emissions are covered by stress tests of banks that look at a forward carbon price. The IMF is helping to oversee this. In fact, now going forward, all of the annual country reviews will look at how climate risk management is undertaken. And to make it very simple, the question of banks is, well, what does your balance sheet look like with a carbon price that's consistent with what the world's demanding, which is 1.5 degrees? Because we can't have our banks fail if society succeeds. The third point was something that Kristalina mentioned and Ngozi touched on, and is consistent with President van der Leyen's Fit for 55 strategy, is there are other ways than a carbon price to internalize the price on carbon and can drive decarbonization, and very much with respect to developing economies, these need to be taken into account. But I just want to underscore something, and Prime Minister, for the example, use the example of Canada, making forward commitments, credible forward commitments to end internal combustion vehicles by 2030. What does that do? Very clear signal in a horizon that drives investment. And you spent a good part of your spring, I know, at investment announcements in the auto sector to prepare the Canadian sector for that new future. Last point, which goes back to the first point in terms of where the carbon price is going to be at the end of the decade. We will announce tomorrow, the UK presidency, an enormous amount of money, an absolutely enormous amount of money that is dedicated to net zero transition. Not dedicated to sustainability, although they care about that, or biodiversity, but to a net zero transition. And not just any net zero transition, a 1.5 degree net zero transition. One of the things that these institutions are demanding of governments is exactly what Prime Minister Trudeau led with, and Kristalina reinforced, in fact this whole panel's reinforced, which is a price on carbon. And what's critical, and this is my final point, is that that price is a forward price and it's credible and predictable. And I'll just finish with this with our hosts, because what Prime Minister, Minister of Environment as part of the government, Catherine McKenna, who's here, all did with our carbon price is to legislate it. So it's not a talking point, it's the law of the land. And businesses and people in Canada know that, and then they act. And we're seeing the investment impact, and I think that really is a model for the world. And if we can triple triple the coverage of a carbon price globally, and if there's confidence that comes out of COP that that's where the world's heading, we will see an investment boom consistent with Prime Minister Loughran's first point, which is this is a very, very positive economic story.
Thank you, thank you. I think you said it very well, and it reinforces the market-driven principle, the nudging of behavior by shaping expectations, because you have the predictability and the credibility moving forward. And I think this is really our homework ahead of what to do. Now I think we don't have any more time for a second round of questions, so I'll just hand it back to Lord Barker to conclude.
Thank you very much, Mary. Well, what a great panel. I've taken far too many notes, and I'm not going to be able to do the panelists justice. I have to say this slightly reminds me of being back in the House of Commons when I had to wind up a debate, but I have to say it's a much more friendly audience, and a lot less critical, I hope. But I think there have been some really important themes that have come out from this discussion. First and foremost, carbon pricing works. We heard about it from the leadership in Canada. We heard about the successful leadership over nearly 3 decades in Sweden. We also heard about it in the European Union, where emissions have been cut by nearly 45% thanks to emissions trading. But we also heard, and need to take on board, it's not that easy. I think one of the reasons that carbon pricing has, all too often stayed in the textbook and not made it onto the statute book is because there are very real societal problems associated with the successful implementation. But Prime Minister Trudeau pointed out that there are, if you're smart, if you're pragmatic, responses to those issues that can be raised. If you have an inclusive conversation, if you look at the wider impacts, it is not beyond smart politicians to actually devise solutions to those problems, which mean that families can actually be net better off as a result. However, we also need to recognize that carbon pricing is more than just a narrow science. And Kristalina, I think, really put it very, very well, that you need carbon pricing, but you also need regulation as well. And you also need to put trade very much at the heart of carbon pricing. And unless you solve this issue of fragmentation, unless you solve this issue, I think you said it's 69 different carbon prices. Great that they've all got one, because we need everyone to adopt it. But unless you have a real global standard, we're never going to get there, not at the pace and scale and speed that we need to in order to keep 1.5 alive. So I think the conclusion from this discussion is that we have here a really effective tool that, unlike 20 years ago, unlike 5 years ago, actually is now proven to work, and that there are sensible solutions to mitigate any problems that could be thrown up. But there needs to be political courage, and we need an inclusive conversation that brings together the developing, the middle income, and the advanced economies. It's to come up with smart solutions. And that, I'm afraid, throws it straight back at the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO to really convene that conversation and actually come up with an outcome. Because the one thing we know about this COP is that we are on borrowed time. Here's a solution. Let's grab it and drive it all forward. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the CPLC for convening this terrific conversation.